Chapter 45, Dark Lowers the Tempest. Dark lowers the tempest. It was colder that day than any they had seen yet, though at least the rain had eased off, the air about them damp and heavy with the scent of wet earth and stagnant water. The trees were thinning as the ground beneath became marshier, the forest slowly giving way to fens as they headed further south, while the sky hung a dull washed-out grey above the mottled canopy of decaying leaves. Frith's feet were wet. She had always thought of her boots as quite well made, but the months of travelling had clearly taken their toll and they hadn't gone a couple of hours through the sodden marshland before they had started leaking. And the way was only getting worse, the ground broken up by expanses of murky green-grey water, the trees and bushes grouped thickly on any ground solid enough to take purchase, their thick gnarled roots twisting down into the wide languid rivers that flowed, albeit very slowly, off through the marsh. Cernd was still at the head of their group, Jahara and Minsk not far behind him as he led them confidently onwards. He was as comfortable there as Jahara, but even so he seemed remarkably sure of the way, and Fritha wondered whether this was really his first visit to the area. A short way behind those three, Ari and Herdalis were walking together, talking mildly, which left herself, Nalia and a Noman bringing up the back, Fritha and Nalia abreast, while the squire followed a few paces behind them. Fritha glanced to the girl at her side, looking cold and weary as she pulled her foot from another sucking patch of bog. Nalia had been waning ever since they had entered the forest, the last few hours trudging through the marshes clearly doing nothing for her friend's spirits. She sent the girl a smile which was returned after a moment, albeit wanly.
"So have you finished that embroidery on your new robes yet?"
Fritha began cheerily with the vain hope of distracting her friend.
"It was looking very nice when I saw it the other night."
But Nalia just shook her head.
"No, I find it hard to sew in just the firelight." "Oh, well, perhaps Ari or Jahara could call up a light for you tonight. I could even have another go at it, if you don't want to ask them." Perhaps."
Fritha sighed, her smile fading in face of the girl's coldness.
"Are you well, dearest?"
A pause as a tired, almost irritated look flitted across Nalia's face before she answered her with a sigh and a bright false smile.
Yes, I am fine."
Fritha understood her exasperation, the sheer effort it took sometimes to pretend all was well. You just wished everyone would merely leave you to your melancholy. She moved to take her hand, Nalia's gloves putting a strange barrier between their skin that Fritha didn't much like, though it hardly mattered in the end. Their hands joined for only a moment before Nalia pulled away under the excuse of adjusting her cloak. Fritha swallowed, trying not to let it hurt.
"Please, dearest, if something is wrong then I'd much rather you told me. Just as you tell me when you are upset."
Nalia countered dully, and Fritha was about to say that was different when she stopped. When she didn't confide in Nalia, it was usually because it was concerning things the girl could do nothing about, and perhaps Nalia realized it too, and that was what she was getting at. Fritha couldn't help her. She couldn't change the weather or where paid work sent them or anything. They continued on in silence, Fritha slowing her pace to allow the girl to draw away from her, walking at Nalia's side merely emphasizing the painful distance between them. It was a move, she considered, that she may soon be regretting though, as she found herself side by side with a Noman. He had been showing signs of wanting to catch her alone again since they had left trade meet, and she had a pretty good idea as to why. Fritha bit back a sigh. It was not that she minded a Noman knowing about her rather dubious ancestry, only that she found the discussion of it rather depressing, her mind forced to dwell on things she usually preferred to forget. She glanced to the man to find him sending her a searching look, and she predicted his words before he even spoke.
"My lady, is something wrong with Nalia? She seems a touch distressed."
Frithha stared at him a moment, surprise and guilt fighting for dominance as all her assumptions were all proved false. She really should stop judging the squire so harshly. The girl glanced ahead to where her friend was now walking alone, huddled under her cloak. Frithha scrubbed a cold hand across her face, trying to keep the weariness she felt from her voice as she answered him.
I have asked her, but she says she is fine. Perhaps she is just tired.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, and they walked on in companionable silence just long enough for Frithha's attention to wander back to her squelching feet when...
Frithha, I wonder if we could continue our conversation from before.
Frithha only just suppressed a groan. She took it all back, the man was a nightmare.
And which one would that be?
She inquired mildly, knowing full well what he was getting at and hoping her feigned ignorance would discourage him. It did not. ARandomAudiobookAppeared frowned, looking somewhat uncertain as he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice.
Well, our talk of your heritage. Sorry. Why your heritage, my lady? Oh right, yes, of course,
she laughed, shaking her head at her own forgetfulness.
I was at a complete loss there for a second. I mean, it's not as though you've been going on about it all morning.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared flushed and she could see the sudden tension in his jaw, his voice low and earnest as he continued.
My lady, I understand you may feel uncomfortable, but it is a matter that has been pressing on me for some time now. Oh, ARandomAudiobookAppeared,
she whined, knowing she sounded like a petulant child and not much caring.
Do we have to go through this again? Really, what is there left to discuss? What, indeed? You may act as though this is a matter of little concern to you, but I cannot believe that is so. Your dark heritage must hold at least some sway over your heart. You must face some internal struggle, feel some urging towards darkness. Will you keep your bloody voice down?
Frithha hissed, throwing a surreptitious glance ahead of them as though she expected the others to be watching.
And since you're refusing to give up on the subject, I have a question for you. How did you find out? You said you heard I was related to Saravik. Well, yes. There is a rumor traveling the order that one of the children was with the group that saved the gate, though it is just a rumor, no one knows it is you.
Frithha sighed. Well, that was something at least.
Simon actually thought it was Herr Dallas,
ARandomAudiobookAppeared added conversationally.
Herr Dallas, wouldn't he laugh if he knew?
Frithha smiled slightly, considering for a moment that quite a bit might have been different had he known. She glanced ahead to where the bard was walking with Ari, an arm about her as they talked quietly, and Frithha felt a twinge. Amusement? Regret? She wasn't sure.
So he does not know,
confirmed ARandomAudiobookAppeared with a frown.
I must admit, I am surprised. Might I ask who does?
Frithha sighed again, and more deeply this time.
Of our company, Jahara, Minsk, and now you, and that is more than enough. You are worried about the others' reactions.
She shrugged mildly.
Not especially. I just don't feel it's particularly important. Do you tell everyone your father's a drunk?
The words had left her mouth before she had even considered them, and Frithha could only turn to him, horrified, ARandomAudiobookAppeared's stance suddenly rigid behind his paled face.
I'm sorry,
she continued quickly,
I didn't mean it like that. No, it is fine, my lady,
he answered after a moment, in a tone of stiff civility.
After all, I have treated your feelings with no more care. Yes, but it's not quite the same. How do I describe it?
She wondered aloud, pressing the heels of her hands to her eyes and wishing everything wasn't so complicated.
Anomen, I only found out about all this but a few months ago. In my mind, Ryan was and will always be my father, and he was a good, kind man, and I feel blessed to have known him. The rest is just blood and dreams. I'm not particularly happy about my ancestry, but I have accepted it.
She shrugged mildly.
What else could I do? And to answer your first question, there is no dark struggle that I am aware of, but if you are truly worried as to the virtue... No, Fritha.
Anomen burst out suddenly, halting to whirl on her with a frustrated look.
Can you not see? It is not a question of your virtue, but my own. This anger I feel sometimes, such rage I can barely control it, it is against all the order teaches. I should be able to suppress it, control it, but I cannot, and I hoped that if you felt as I do, if you fought against it as I must, then you could show me the way.
He trailed off, looking embarrassed by his outburst as he turned abruptly to continue their path after the others, and Fritha fell into step beside him, feeling tired and depressed.
I'm sorry, Anomen, I understand it must be frustrating struggling with something others seem to find so simple, but perhaps you could speak with Sir Ryan or the prelate about it. I know you probably feel alone in this, but I cannot believe what you are experiencing is so uncommon, and they would be in a much better position to help you than I.
She was smiling hopefully at him, but it soon faded in face of the blank look he was sending her.
You would not even attempt to understand.
He had stopped walking again and was staring down at her, his pale eyes dark under lowered brows. Fritha mouthed a moment, trying to find the words to explain herself.
Now, Anomen, I have tried. No, my lady, you are correct,
he cut in, his bitterness audible.
Please do not concern yourself with this any longer. I see now it was wrong to come to you. Anomen, stop being,
she cried, taking his sleeve as he made to march off, the others glancing back to them at the sound.
No.
He snapped, snatching back his arm and sounding as though he was struggling to keep his temper.
Now just stand away from me a moment that I might gather my thoughts.
Fritha stared up at him, very aware of the others just ahead of them, all looking on with a clear interest, barring Cernde, who seemed to be doing his best to pretend he had not noticed, the druid taking a sudden and keen interest in the local flora. Nalia was watching them, pale and drawn beneath her hood, and Fritha felt a sudden surge of anger at how unfair everything seemed. She only ever tried to help, and all she got was grief.
Fine,
she heard herself say,
if that's what you want, then fine, because I've had enough.
And with that she just continued walking, her movement seeming to rouse the others, and everyone turned to once more resume their journey, an uncomfortable silence descending over them. Fritha pulled up her hood and kept her head down. Her face felt hot, her mind swimming with all the things she wished she had said to the man, how she wasn't surprised he hadn't gone to Sir Ryan with his problems if that was how he treated people who tried to help him, and how it wasn't any of his sodding business who her father had been anyway. A movement just on the edge of her hood, and she glanced up to see Nalia had dropped back to walk at her side once more. The girl sent her a small smile, Fritha turning her face sullenly back to the path ahead, though she did not pull away as Nalia took her hand. Jahara walked on, cold and tired and blissfully aware of the myriad of life all around her, the marsh so thrumming with it that she could not help but be filled with a deep sense of peace that she found all too rarely those days. Though it appeared their surroundings were not bringing out the best in some of the others, Fritha and Anomen's quarrel the only jarring note in the otherwise tranquil hum of her mind. Still, the girl seemed no worse for it, now talking quietly with Nalia, and as for the squire, well, he had been in an odd humor for days now, ever since his meeting with his superiors at the order, and she wondered if the man was not now regretting his decision in the face of what it could have cost him. Regrets. Who did not have them? And her mind was drawn inevitably back to the worry that had been pressing on her for days now, Galvary and his persistent interest in Fritha. Bernard had informed her just before they had left the city that her presence was once more expected at the hold, but they had departed in such a rush in the end that Jahara had not had chance to attend. It was something she had been only too glad of at the time, though the knowledge of it hung over her still, that doom-laden sense that she was merely delaying the inevitable. If only she had ignored Galvary's initial summons. But then she would not have been reunited with Derman, and she recalled with painful clarity the pleasure of her last meeting with the man, sat in a local tavern with a few of their brethren, some she knew of old, others new to her, the group playing cards and discussing the latest troubles and triumphs across Faerun that so united them in their cause. It was at times like that she truly realized that her place was with the Harpers, the sense of purpose it gave her. It was similar to the feeling she had as a druid, the idea that she was a part of something so much wider, greater. Jahara sighed slightly to herself, watching the changing colors and textures of the undergrowth as they walked on. She had never felt comfortable alone, not physically but mentally, always a hunger burning within her ever since she was young to be connected to other things, other people. Perhaps the need came from never knowing her parents, having no past to anchor her to the world, no family to which she would always belong. Jahara shook her head, not in the mood for any soul-searching, and she glanced back to check on those following, when a glimpse of tawny fur in the undergrowth next to them caught her eye.
"Hold, everyone! We are attacked!"
But her answer was not the low growl she expected but a voice, harsh and just as unwelcome, a lean dark-haired man stepping from the bushes next to them, the great tawny leopard she had seen at his side.
"You have good eyes, outsider," he began with a sneer and a nod to her, turning to the rest of them to order loudly, "You will go back the way you have come, all of you. This area is under the control of the druids of this grove, leave now or face nature's wrath." "And by what authority do you make this threat?" came a voice next to her, just as ringing, just as forceful, and Jahara glanced to the man at her side, Cern drawing back his hood to at last reveal his face, the serene expression he wore looking suddenly rigid. "This is not our way, Podden."
Podden could have looked no more surprised if Sylvanus himself had suddenly appeared in their midst.
"Cern, you have been away for some time. Much has changed."
"So I see," Cern agreed, and in a tone that indicated exactly what he thought of these changes.
"The Grand Druid has not heard good things about what has been happening here, attacks on the townsfolk without cause, the enslavement of animals to fight for you and be slaughtered in your stead."
Podden swallowed, looking uncomfortable.
"It is the new way, Cern. We have a new leader to follow and she has moved us in this direction."
Cern frowned, disquiet flickering behind his eyes.
"She? And what of Gragas? Was he not great druid of this grove?" "Yes, but he was challenged and replaced. Faldern leads now and none have dared challenge her as yet." "Faldern,"
Cern repeated, smiling grimly as he shook his head,
"I should have realized. So, instead of taking a stand, you follow as ants and do her foul deeds. Have you not the courage to face her?"
If Cern meant to shame the man, he failed, Podden ignoring his slight to send him a measured look.
"She has bonded with the grove, Cern."
Jahara felt the cold air burn her throat as she drew a sharp breath, the sudden paleness of his skin the only sign to give away Cern's alarm, and she could sense the others around them sharing blank looks as Podden continued.
"She claims the Earth Mother speaks to her through the land, that it is by her will that she orders these attacks. She is invincible outside of the challenges."
Cern's face was set as he retreated back into his hood.
"Then we shall meet in terms she will understand.
Podden looked for a moment as though he would warn against this course before he sighed and shook his head.
Sirnd, I do not enjoy this new role we now take, but others do. Walk carefully.
And with that, he turned and was lost to the trees, the cat lingering to give them all a measured look before turning to prowl after him. Jahara glanced discerned as the group continued on their way, the man hidden again in his hood, grey eyes staring mildly out at world. He was as stoic as ever, though she could tell this meeting had shaken him, as well as confirming her suspicions which had been building since they had first arrived in the fenlands. This was not the first visit Sirnd had made to the grove, indeed he had led them with a confidence that spoke of someone knew the place quite intimately. At first, Jahara had wondered if Coprath had not been deceived in the druid's intentions, that he was perhaps leading them into a trap. But no longer. It was clear this news of the great druid's demise had come as a shock, and as for someone bonding with the grove.
This news disturbs you, does it not?
Came a smooth voice at her side, and Jahara turned to find Sirnd watching her.
Indeed, no servant of nature could hear of such an abuse and not feel a deep repulsion.
Jahara nodded, more than ready to get some sort of explanation from him.
This Faldern, when Podden spoke of her, it seemed she was not unknown to you.
Sirnd nodded once.
Indeed, that is so. She was a shadow druid, though she was admitted to the grove not long before I joined, claiming to have left her violent ways with her sisters on the Sword Coast. But the fox cannot lie down with the dog, and we did not sit well together. As for her bonding with the grove, if her desire for power was as vehement as it was when I left here, I can well believe of her this atrocity.
Sirnd sighed and shook his head, the shadow of some past regret crossing his face, before he blinked and it was gone.
She draws power from the land to further strengthen herself, and at great cost to the surrounding area too. Such a ritual is almost unheard of. It will be as Podden said, she will be invincible outside of official challenges.
He sighed again, his eyes darkening.
I must be prepared for her. We must be prepared,
Jahara corrected firmly. He nodded once and smiled, the gesture not quite lifting the worry from his eyes, and they walked on in silence for a while, Jahara about to ask him why he had not mentioned his suspicions or the fact he was known there to begin with, when a shout from behind them cut her off.
Hey, what's that?
And Jahara looked back to see Fritha pointing through the trees to a long arc of stone that spanned the broad river they had been following for the last hour.
A bridge,
came Ari, standing on her tiptoes as she strained to get a better look.
What's a bridge doing over the middle of a swamp?
Sirnd smiled, glancing to Fritha as they drew closer, and Jahara saw that the bridge did not arc back down into the marshes as she would have expected, but ended high above the waters on an outcrop of pale sandy rock, upon which was set a large dilapidated house, the forest closing in thick about it.
As you see, it is not so much a bridge over something as a path to something. As the tale goes, it was built some time ago by a mage who had offended his peers and wanted to disappear for a while. The grove was not so well established back then, and the local druids did little to stop him. The mage eventually left or died, and the place has been empty for decades.
They had reached the foot of the bridge by now, the red-tiled roof of the house just visible above the smooth stone crest.
Well, it can't be occupied now,
said Ari,
the druids surely wouldn't allow it. There's no smoke from the chimney,
offered Nalia quietly.
Come, you can have a better look as we pass by it. The bridge makes for the best route over the river,
said Sirnd, taking the first step onto the crumbling stonework, and the group followed, Fritha sensing the general relief of those around her as they stepped up out of the marsh to finally have something solid underfoot. The girl smiled. The view was quite beautiful from up there, the fens around them a lush jungle of greens broken here and there with pocks and slivers of dazzling white, the pools and rivers reflecting brilliantly as the sun sank low in the west, the dying light casting a golden hue over the run-down sandstone house before them. It had once been a rather grand building from the look of it, with 4 stout chimneys all along the roof and even a circular tower on the northern side, which now provided a fine roost for the local murder of crows.
"I'm going to see what's inside,"
announced Fritha to the group, though few seemed to heed her, Jahara nodding vaguely as she, Minsk and Cern studied their map, using their vantage point to assess the path ahead. Meanwhile, Ari and Nalya were occupied in the exact opposite, stood on the other side of the bridge gazing out across the marshland they had just crossed. Herr Dallas stood on the wall next to them, craning his neck above the surrounding trees and claiming he could see the town. Fritha turned back to the house, though her departure was not unnoticed by everyone, it seemed.
"You cannot go alone, my lady,"
a familiar voice called after her, heavy rattling footsteps already closing on her position. Fritha ignored him and opened the door to the shriek of rusted hinges.
"Hello, anyone here?"
As expected, no answer came and Fritha took a step inside. It certainly didn't look occupied, the cupboards and shelves that lined the walls all empty unless you counted cobwebs and dust, while the hearth was filled with cold grey ash, the woodpile next to it bearing only a few miserable twigs, Fritha doing her best to ignore a no-man's presence as she moved further into the room. 2 more doors led from it, one in the wall opposite which she assumed went outside, another set to the right of her and slightly ajar. She could see another similar room beyond it, and Fritha was just moving to peer inside when the back door banged open. Fritha glanced up with a start as a middle-aged woman entered, her arms full of firewood that was soon clattering to the floor as she threw her hands up with a shrill cry.
"Oh, please, calm yourself,"
Fritha soothed frantically, guilt welling with the memories of the old housekeeper at Isia's estate.
"I'm so sorry, we thought this house was empty." "What happens in here?"
came another voice behind her and Fritha whirled to see Herr Dallas peering around the front door and sending a no-man a suspicious look.
Ari said she thought she heard a shout.
But the woman had already stopped screaming, a hand held to her chest as she caught her breath and Fritha was relieved to see she was actually smiling as she sank into a rickety old chair which was set before the unlit hearth.
I am sorry, you just gave me a fright, miss. I should have locked the door, especially with those druids about, but my sons are out hunting and I do not like to think of them shut outside. As you can see, I cannot hear the door when I am at the back of the house."
She drew another deep breath, smoothed her apron and politely held a hand out to her.
"I am Sarah, miss."
Fritha smiled gratefully as she shook her hand, glad to see the woman was not angry at their intrusion. Though much older than her, she held a matronly beauty, her lined skin the rich dark brown of Kalimshite tea, while her hair fell black and shiny about her shoulders from under the scarf she had tied over her head.
"Nice to meet you, madam,"
Fritha smiled, kneeling to gather up the firewood that now scattered the floor as she made her introductions.
"I am Fritha and this is a no-man and Herr Dallas. We have other companions outside as well, we are sent to investigate the druids on behalf of the town."
Sarah shook her head, clucking her tongue sadly.
"Ah, has it got so bad for them already? Those poor people. I wish you every speed then."
Behind her, Fritha heard the squire clear his throat.
"Forgive my interest, madam, but I would ask what you are doing here. We were under the impression this building has been deserted for some time."
The woman smiled ruefully.
"I am afraid our tale is a sad one, good sir. We did live quite happily in a farm just north of Trademead not so long ago, but my husband died recently. I was not his first wife and his eldest son from his previous marriage inherited everything. We were tolerated there for a few days, but after that it was clear I and my sons were welcome in our house no longer. We are not of these lands, you see, and have always been distrusted because of it. I was very distressed, for we had little money and even fewer friends, but then one of my sons spoke of a deserted old house he had seen on his hunts in the southern swamps. With no other choice available to us, we traveled south."
The woman gestured about her, visibly brightening.
"What luck then, to find this house still empty and quite habitable for all the neglect. I felt as though the gods smiled on us still. I and my 2 sons moved in a 10-day or so ago. As you can see, we have much work yet to do here. We are living mostly in the upper floors at the moment, but I do not believe it will be long before this place will feel as a home to us." "And have the druids not taken any interest in your residence?"
questioned Herr Dallas, the woman shaking her head mildly.
"Why, no. My sons said they have been warned a time or two whilst out hunting in the swamp, but they have not come to the house. Perhaps they have yet to realize we are here, and mistook my sons as men of the town, for I am very careful about when I light the fires."
Frithla straightened to finally set the sticks onto the woodpile with a polite nod.
"Well, we are sorry again for startling you, madam. We shall leave you in peace, unless trade meets in a bit of a state since the druid attacks began. I don't suppose you've enough food stored to let us buy some, have you?"
Frithla expected a regretful no, but to her surprise the woman beamed.
"Why, but of course. My sons are excellent hunters, and we have more than enough to spare you some. Come through, come through."
She rose, eagerly bustling into the adjoining room, and Frithla left the 2 men to follow the woman, Sarah throwing open a large chest set against the far wall, bending double as she searched through it.
"There you are,"
she trilled, finally straightening to turn back to her with a smile, a few joints of cured meat in her hands. But Frithla just stared back at her, frozen as she looked past the gift to notice the orange and black striped tail that was peeking out from beneath her skirts.
You're...
So? Began Anoman after a moment of awkward silence. It was the first time he had been alone with Herr Dallas since their fight the 2 nights before, and the squire was feeling a little uncomfortable.
"How is Ari finding this day's travel?"
"Sorry?" Herr Dallas questioned, looking more than confused, and Anoman hastened to explain himself.
"Well, I merely ask because Nalia does not seem to be faring particularly well, and they are neither of them accustomed to the hardships of the soldier's life."
Herr Dallas laughed genially.
"Oh yes, I see now at what you drive, Knightling. Ari is bearing up well enough. It is as the Raven once said, she is stronger than she would seem from first impressions."
"Yes, quite," Anoman agreed absently, recalling his own incredulity when he had realized the slight and stuttering elf was a member of a mercenary group.
"And how is the Raven coping?"
Herr Dallas continued mildly, his tone all innocence.
"She seemed to have more than lost her patience with the day earlier."
Anoman felt himself flush, knowing exactly what Herr Dallas was implying, and he was about to tell the bard to mind his own business when a scream cut him off. Anoman sprang for the door, but Herr Dallas was already ahead of him, the pair crashing though into next room only to stop. Gone was the woman Sarah, and in her place towered what looked to be a tiger that had learned to walk on its hind legs, a huge scimitar already in its hand, the creature looking almost ridiculous, still wearing the half-torn remnants of the dress. It was the jinn's quarry, Itafir. With a speed that belied its awkward form, the Rakshasa swung out at the girl before it, Frithla hastily parrying the blow, catching it clumsily on the edge on her own sword. A loud crack split the air, and both girl and creature stood frozen in surprise as they watched the blade of Fritha's sword arc across the room to land with a clatter at the tiefling's feet. For a split second, no one moved, when suddenly everything was happening at once, the creature drawing back its sword with a deafening roar, Frithha shouting a word a no man hadn't heard outside of the roughest dockside taverns as she leapt backwards, and it was only by her own natural agility that she was spared, the curved blade missing her by hair's breadth. Herr Dallas was racing to help her and a no man followed, the small room seeming impossibly long as he watched Frithha frantically dodge another blow, the creature's blade missing her to shatter the door of the cabinet behind. Roars and shouts were coming from the room behind them as the others joined the battle, no doubt drawn by Frithha's scream, and now fighting Etafir's brothers, the creatures clearly coming to their sister's aid. Frithha had just dodged another swing, the girl stumbling slightly as she leapt sideways into a low chest, and the Rakshasa looked as though it would finally have its chance when Herr Dallas reached it with a shout. The creature whirled just in time to block the tiefling's swords, though a no man's mace was another matter, the squire swinging out with such a force it stung his hand even through his glove as the blow made contact with the creature's skull and Etafir dropped like a stone. Herr Dallas moved quickly to check on the other room and their companions, but from the quiet murmur of voices, the squire could tell their battle was over as well, and a no man turned instantly to Frithha. Whether she had tripped or just sank to the floor by her own accord, the girl was there now, sat in amongst the splintered wood drawing deep breaths and smiling in a faint sort of way, both hands held spread over her chest as though she couldn't quite believe she was still whole.
"Are you hurt, my raven?"
asked Herr Dallas, walking back to them. The girl shook her head, accepting the hand he proffered her and allowing him to help her stand.
No, I'm fine. How are the others?" "We are all unharmed in here,"
called Jahara from the other room, and Frithha nodded.
"Good, that's good,"
she sighed, still rubbing her abdomen absently as she leaned back against the cabinet behind her. A no man swallowed, his heart still rattling unpleasantly in his chest, stomach churning. He felt as though he had just sprinted a league.
"Are you sure you are well, my lady? You look very pale."
Frithha glanced to him, a certain steel creeping back in her manner which was both heartening and disappointing to see, her tone clipped as she answered him.
"As I said, Anoman, I'm fine. Spread out."
She continued more generally as she began to dust herself down.
"Search the house, I want to know what these Rakshasa have been up to since they took hiding in here. Did you lot hear that?"
Shouts of assent from the other room, and Frithha turned to begin searching through the cabinet behind her. Herr Dallas sent a no man a wry smile.
"As it was said, they are stronger than they look."
End of chapter.